they did in the Philippines what Americans do here to our own. The Pentagon ran a secret anti-vax campaign to undermine China during the pandemic. The U.S. military launched a clandestine program amid the COVID crisis to discredit China's Sinovac inoculation. Payback for Beijing's efforts to blame Washington for the pandemic. One target, the Filipino public. Health experts say the gambit was indefensible and put innocent lives at risk. Yeah, I did say that. That was funny. Every insane conspiracy that ended up being true.
Heart attack pistol. In 1975, William Colby.
Wait, what is this? This is extremely in the pocket of things that I'm interested in.
Colby, the CIA director at the time, had to testify in front of a committee that was investigating the CIA. This happened because there were many accusations of assassinations of foreign and American politicians from the CIA, so the U.S. Senate put it under investigation for alleged covert action abuses, which resulted in 14 reports of major abuses by the CIA, FBI, and NSA. However, there was an accusation, or conspiracy theory, that was much more worrying than the rest of them. It was thought that the CIA had developed a pistol that could fire a poisoned dart from around 300 feet, cause death, and leave no trace of what the cause was. When William Colby declared that they had a poison dart gun that was potentially basically completely silent, felt like a mosquito bite to the target, went through clothes, caused a heart attack, and left no traces but a small red spot because the dart melted, the public was shocked. Furthermore, it was revealed that this wasn't an isolated case. It was part of Project MK Naomi, a project designed to increase U.S. biological and chemical warfare capabilities. This was the only time this gun was shown in public.
Nice.
USA's fake Cuban terrorist attack. In 1962, during the Cold War, tensions between the US and Cuba were high because Fidel Castro had risen to power in Cuba and allowed communists to join the new Cuban government, nationalized US businesses, and improved relations with the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles capable of hitting the US on Cuban.
Unacceptable. Wait. You can tell a lot about an account's politics and understanding of historical understanding of a history if they mention what preceded the Cuban Missile Crisis. Very important. Now, of course, as a Turkish man, this hits close to home. As a Turkish man, this hits a little close to home because, once again, Turkey not mentioned, okay? But Turkey at the table. Once again, Turkey at the table. Turkey is the table. For those of you who don't know, Russia said that the USSR said that they were going to put missiles on Cuba, directed in the United States of America's direction after the United States of America put NATO missile bases in Turkey.
Soil after the U.S. placed theirs on Italy and Turkey. Operation Northwoods was a plan by the United States.
Respect. Hey, respect to the paint explainer. Okay, respect. You can tell a lot. You can tell a lot about a YouTuber and their genuine interest and genuine curiosity in history and understanding of the world by what they choose to omit and what they choose to mention. Specifically Turkey. Very important to mention.
Department of Defense to stage terrorist attacks against American citizens and blame the Cuban government in order to justify a war against Cuba. They wanted to hijack civilian planes and make them appear as if U.S. Air Force planes were shot down by Cuba, to simulate the downing of a U.S. fighter jet off the coast of Cuba, to blow a U.S. ship, and to organize terrorist attacks in U.S. cities. The plan also included creating a Cuban communist terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington, which would involve bombing.
By the way, how insane is that the federal government, like our state intelligence apparatus, was actively talking about doing this?
civilian targets. The plan was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but was ultimately rejected by President John F. Kennedy because it would have been too risky and could have led to a full-scale war with the Soviet Union. CIA's fake animals. In the 1970s, the CIA developed what they called the Insectothopter, which was a drone the size of a dragonfly and hand-painted to look like one. It was kept secret until December 2003, when it was revealed to the public at the CIA Museum, and the project was abandoned because it was too difficult to fly in crosswinds. Another similar project was the AeroVironment Nano Hummingbird, created with specifications given by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. These weren't the only times they used animals or crafted fake animals to spy on their enemies. During the Cold War, they developed a camera so light that it could be carried by pigeons in order to take aerial photos.
I wonder what happened to John F. Kennedy. Does anybody know? Like, after he said he didn't want to do the whole, like, false flag terror attack that would kill American citizens? Sure hope he, had a wonderful blossoming presidential career to completion. Seems like he's got a good head on his shoulders.
And they even trained some of these pigeons to drop eavesdropping devices onto window ledges. However, despite successfully placing some of these devices, no usable audio was captured from them. They even used fake fish to secretly check water samples for the presence of nuclear runoff or other suspicious substances. USA's fake Vietnam attack. In 1964, tensions between the United States
Okay, this account is amazing.
and North Vietnam were at an all-time high, and things worsened on the 2nd of August when North Vietnamese forces shot at a U.S. destroyer while it was doing a covert operation close to North Vietnamese territorial waters. The U.S. government then, on the 4th of August, said that a second attack happened, while this was false. The commander of the Maddox, Captain John Herrick, initially reported the attack but later expressed doubts, attributing the radar signals to freak weather effects. And despite these uncertainties, the Lyndon Johnson administration relied on misinterpreted communications intercepts to conclude that the attack was real. Also, in October 2005, the New York Times reported that Robert J. Hanyuk, an historian for the NSA, concluded that the NSA distorted intelligence reports passed to policymakers. He said agency staff deliberately skewed the evidence to make it appear that an attack had occurred. This was probably done with the goal of providing the Johnson administration with the justification needed for military action in Vietnam. Years after the incident, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the time, admitted himself that the August 4th attack had
Wait a minute, what?
never occurred. The Johnson administration was probably just seeking a reason to escalate American involvement in Vietnam as Cold War tensions increased, and the domino theory made its way through the U.S. military, which said that the fall of one country to communism would lead to the fall of others in the region, causing more fear. Because of this false operation, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Johnson broad powers to conduct military operations in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. Canada's gay radar. At that time,
What? Okay, this one I didn't know either. What are we talking about? Every insane conspiracy theory that turned out to be true. That America staged a fake attack to America created a fake attack to set the stage to invade Vietnam. That the CIA has a heart attack gun. That America openly, like the CIA openly tried to do a false flag terror incident to also set the stage to invade Cuba.
homosexual people were persecuted by the Canadian government, and they were trying to find new ways to get rid of them from public jobs, especially the police and military. In the 1960s, Dr. Frank Robert Wake, a psychology professor at Carleton University, developed what's called the gaydar or fruit machine, which was a series of psychological tests with the purpose of...
Okay, this is so funny because it's like, dog, you're Canadian. It's gonna do false positives across the board, you know?
Of identifying gay men. It worked by using erotic images and what were thought to be homosexual words to see if there were any physiological changes that could point to a sexual arousal, such as the dilation of their pupils. Of course, this machine was completely pseudoscientific and unreliable. The room's light could change the dilation of the pupil, and many more outside variables made it faulty. Nonetheless, these tests caused hundreds, if not thousands, of people to get fired. The US government poisoned alcohol. From 1920 to 1933, the United States banned alcohol, entering the Prohibition era. This made the alcohol black market flourish, enabling criminal organizations like the mafia to enrich themselves. So the United States government had to find a way to stop this. They went to extreme lengths to try to reduce the black market's activity and to make people stop drinking, but their efforts had poor results. So the government became frustrated and started adding large amounts of methyl alcohol, a substance that made the illegal drinks really dangerous, as a very small amount of undiluted methyl alcohol could kill a human being. This was probably done thinking that the black market sellers would have avoided selling poisoned alcohol to their customers, as they would have lost them when they died. But they didn't take into account that the demand for illegal alcohol was so booming at the time that the sellers didn't really care about their customers' lives. The effects quickly showed. In 1926, in New York City, 585 people died from this government action, and over 5,000 fatalities from this poisoning, at least a 600% increase
I don't know this either.
from the previous deaths from alcohol, were said to have resulted in the entire country. CIA's fake vaccines. During the hunt
I didn't know this. This account is amazing.
for Osama bin Laden, the CIA conducted a secret operation using a fake hepatitis vaccination program in Pakistan to illegally collect blood samples and confirm the presence of bin Laden or his family. The CIA planned to compare the DNA samples collected from the program with the DNA of bin Laden's sister, who had died in Boston in 2010. The program ultimately failed. It led to the arrest of a participating doctor, Shakil Afridi, and was widely criticized for undermining public health. The operation is blamed for increasing vaccine hesitancy in Pakistan and triggering violence against healthcare workers, who were perceived as spies. As a result, Pakistan saw a resurgence of polio, becoming the country with the highest number of polio cases in the world by 2014. The CIA director issued a directive in 2013 prohibiting the agency from using vaccination programs for operational purposes, including
Would it shock you to find out that the CIA deliberately spread vaccine misinformation as recently as 2021 and 2022? I wonder if he'll talk about this, but China, in an effort to increase soft power and also not be weird, gross, profit-seeking monsters, decided to send Sinovac, their own COVID vaccine, to the Philippines. Now, if you know anything about China, there's a lot of, let's just say, back and forth, a lot of water wars going on in the South China Sea, where Filipino boats will sometimes be sprayed with water by the Chinese Coast Guard. So there's already a little bit of friction between the two nations, but China wanted to offer a lending hand to the Philippines, whereas Western nations were taking their sweet time in delivering vaccines to the country. America saw this as a major problem. The American State Department looked at that and thought, we can't have people in the Philippines feeling like China is there to protect them. So they worked tirelessly behind the scenes to create anti-vaccine campaigns in the Philippines to undermine the public opinion on vaccination campaigns in general, and specifically Sinovac, that the Chinese vaccine would kill you if you took it. They did in the Philippines what Americans do here to our own. The Pentagon ran a secret anti-vax campaign to undermine China during the pandemic. The U.S. military launched a clandestine program amid the COVID crisis to discredit China's Sinovac inoculation. Payback for Beijing's efforts to blame Washington for the pandemic. One target, the Filipino public. Health experts say the gambit was indefensible and put innocent lives at risk. Anywhere where you saw countries that deal with China, where there is like a tremendous number of anti-vaxxer fears, who knows if the State Department had a hand in that? We know for a fact that they did in the Philippines. And that was certainly almost a decade after the CIA openly came out and were like, my bad about the Osama bin Laden, Pakistan situation. Yeah. Hashtag China Ong virus. There's posts identified by Reuters, matched the messaging timeframe and design of the U.S. military's anti-vax propaganda campaign in the Philippines. Former and current military officials say. Social media platform X also identified the account as fake and removed it. COVID came from China, and the vaccine also came from China. Don't trust China. One typical tweet from July 2020 read in Tagalog. The words were next to a photo of a syringe beside a Chinese flag and soaring chart of infections. Another post read from China, PPE, face mask, vaccine, fake. But the coronavirus is real. The U.S. military's anti-vax efforts began in the spring of 2020 and expanded beyond Southeast Asia before it was terminated in mid-2021, Reuters determined. So it was expanded beyond Southeast Asia. He doesn't understand a simple gambit. Yeah, that's true. It was a gambit, dude. It wasn't a tactical misinformation campaign. You're right, Chatter. Oh, man. I didn't realize it was a simple gambit. Oh, man. Masterful gambit, America.
Recruiting healthcare workers. It's in situations like these that we see the impact information has on our perception and beliefs. The health of the Pakistani population was undermined by disinformation that caused disbelief in the healthcare system. It's crucial to get an objective view on matters. For example, news outlets might frame stories through a different lens based on their political leanings and interests. Fortunately, today's sponsor, Ground News, addresses this issue by enabling us to see a broader, unbiased perspective by gathering information from a multitude of sources. For example, it has been reported that Mexico warned they would impose their own tariffs in retaliation if Trump were to impose a 25% tariff on Mexican goods. 348 sources reported on this, primarily from the center, with less coverage from right and left-leaning outlets. This creates what Ground News calls a potential blind spot in critical analysis for people who typically consume right and left-leaning sources. The differences in
I do find it funny that many of my friends who do wonderful YouTube videos, and this guy I don't know, but he very clearly is like a smart guy, have Ground News as like a major advertiser. And Ground News is still, at the end of the day, using a lot of faulty methodology to figure out what their bias chart is, including but not limited to, as far as I understand, the Koch brother, funded Poynter Institute. Like media bias ranking structures are entirely dominated by far-right billionaires that have set up these like supposedly apolitical apolitical institutions that almost always churn out almost always exhibit a right-wing bias.
coverage between political leanings are clear. For example, a right-leaning source calls Trump's tariff proposition a threat, while a left-leaning source describes the situation in a more intense way. Ground News doesn't tell you what to think. They gather the world's news to help you come to your own independent conclusions. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum, so I can see stories I normally wouldn't have. I really think Ground News' mission aligns with what I aim to do here on my channel, so go to ground.news.
I don't think these guys know that, by the way. And also I still don't have an issue with Ground News. I don't really care.
news/TPE to stay informed with context you can't find anywhere else. Or scan my QR code for 50% off the same top-tier Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all their features. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Operation Sea Spray. In 1950, the Navy wanted to test the vulnerability of a city like San Francisco to a biological weapons attack in a project called Operation Sea Spray. To do so, they released two types of bacteria, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, into San Francisco Bay. The operation happened between September 20th and 27th, and the bacteria were released from a ship off the coast of San Francisco. It's said that they did this because they thought they would have been harmless to humans, but on October 11th, 11 residents checked into Stanford Hospital in San Francisco with very rare, serious urinary tract infections. 10 of them recovered, but one man, who had had recent prostate surgery, died 3 weeks later from a heart valve infection. His relatives later tried to sue the government, but they lost because the bacteria used in the test was unproven to be responsible for his death. The urinary tract outbreak was so unusual that the Stanford doctors wrote it up for a medical journal. None of the other hospitals in the city reported similar spikes in cases, and all 11 victims had urinary tract infections following medical procedures, suggesting that the source of their infections was inside the hospital. Cases of pneumonia in San Francisco also increased after Serratia marcescens was released, even though a causal relationship has not been established. Overall, the Army determined that San Francisco had received enough of—
Dude, it's so crazy that, like, the American government is so out of pocket. This is something I try to explain to people all the time. Like, they don't even care about Americans, man. Like, what is the expectation that they would ever care about, like, Palestinians or Pakistani people or the Filipino population? They don't even care about Americans. These same institutions are supposed to, you know, protect all Americans from enemies, both domestic and foreign. Meanwhile, we need protection from the military.
of a dose for nearly all of the city's 800,000 residents to inhale at least 5,000 of the particles, which is within the range of infectivity for anthrax. Project Sunshine. Project Sunshine was a series of research studies done by the US government that began in 1953 to see the impact of radioactive fallout on the world's population, which remained secret until 3 years later, in 1956. They wanted to see the body's reaction to radioactive isotope strontium-90, which represented the most serious threat to human health from nuclear fallout, especially on kids, since they're—
I think this was done in my neighborhood VA. When I lived in Brentwood, there were certain parts that the VA owned. There was a dog park in Brentwood where there were certain parts that the VA, like certain land that the military owned, that was plotted out for the VA. And you were just like not allowed to. The one next to the Getty, that's a massive facility. Exactly. And I think that that's where they did this Project Sunshine, if I'm not mistaken.
young developing bone tissues have the highest propensity to accumulate strontium-90, and thus they have the highest susceptibility to radiation damage. Of course, this type of experiment wasn't that feasible, since doing it on alive humans would be an ethical monstrosity, and there weren't many familiars that would like to donate their deceased loved ones to be experimented on like this. Somehow, though, 1,500 sample cadavers, mostly babies and young children, appeared out of nowhere. That's because they were taken from countries ranging from Australia to Europe, often without their parents' consent or knowledge. A British mother had even said that her stillborn baby's legs were removed by British doctors, and to prevent her from finding out what had happened, she was not allowed to dress the baby for the funeral. The Dalai Lama worked for the CIA. During the Cold War, it seemed like China and its—
This guy's awesome. Mr. Tongue Suck. The Dalai Lama did work for the CIA. It's kind of funny because the CIA just gave up on Tibet. That's why he's saying worked for the CIA. They did. They literally had a program. They spent a bunch of money on it. And then I've never actually looked into it, but I wonder why they just straight up gave up on it. They're like, whatever. Like they shelved the destabilizing, like the destabilization initiatives that they wanted to implement in Tibet. There was like a big free Tibet movement. Some of it is also obviously, uh, born out of people and their frustrations, specifically as it pertains to Dalai Lama. Oh yeah, I think they did. They did do that when Nixon normalized relations. You're right. But in a lot of instances, they don't actually do that. Like they don't actually give up on stuff like that far long after. I mean, it's like Nixon normalizing relations also still Nixon's normalization agreements also still came with what's the term? I mean, the normal term is lying, but there's another term that they used to use, strategic ambiguity. Across China's west, the Communist Party is placing children in boarding schools to assimilate a generation of Tibetans into the national mainstream and mold them into loyal citizens. Country that bombs schools with 4,000-pound bunker busters calls out country that provides boarding schools for its kids. Hundreds of thousands of Tibetan children are being separated. I mean, you'll see more of this sort of stuff in the upcoming administration, especially as we gear up. We redirect all of our efforts into all the evil that China is doing. So there'll be, I think what America is going to do in the next decade, as far as like anti-Chinese sentiment, is going to make anything that we've seen so far look silly. They openly allotted almost $2 billion to specifically this, some of which is these kinds of initiatives. Like they have a lot of money invested in instilling anti-Chinese sentiment.
Its Communist Party wanted to increase their influence on Tibet, which worried the United States.
Tibet.
Consequently, the CIA created what was called the CIA Tibetan Program, where they trained and strengthened various isolated Tibetan resistance groups, which eventually led to the creation of a paramilitary force of 2,000 men. They also sent military supplies in stealthy ways to not attract China's attention, and they spread pro-Tibetan propaganda by showing the human rights abuses in Tibet under Chinese rule. The plan reached $1.7 million of annual funding, and the funny thing is that the Dalai Lama himself received an annual salary of $180,000 from the late 1950s to the mid-1970s, even though he stated that he used most of the funds received from the CIA to finance the activities of the Tibetan government in exile. His brother, Gyalo Thondup, was also considered a CIA's top asset. The program ended after President Nixon visited China to establish closer relations in 1972, but the Dalai Lama and his brother thought that this demonstrated that the US didn't care about genuinely helping the Tibetan people, but that they were following their own interests in the Cold War. The US president's wife became the real president. Edith Wilson was the wife of President Woodrow Wilson when, in October 1919, he suffered a stroke that heavily incapacitated him. They hid the true extent of the president's illness and disability from the American public, and although she was never officially elected president of the United States, she played a significant role in managing the country after her husband's condition, and some scholars even call her the secret president or the first woman president. She took control of many of the day-to-day functions of the executive branch, deciding which communications, issues, and matters of state were important enough to bring to the bedridden president's attention. For this reason, she required that all members of the cabinet send urgent matters, memoranda, correspondence, questions, and requests to her. In this way, she became the sole link of communication between the president and his cabinet. Even though she claimed that she didn't take any decisions herself, her role as a potential gatekeeper of info gave her lots of power and influence, and some suggest that she even successfully pushed for the removal of secretary.
Another example that comes to mind is also Ronald Reagan and Jill Biden with Joseph Robinette Brandon.
Secretary of State Robert Lansing, CIA's cat spies. In the 1960s, Operation Acoustic Kitty was launched, which aimed to use cats as spies. This project's estimated cost, according to former CIA officer Victor Marchetti, was around $20 million, and the procedure consisted of implanting a microphone in the cat's ear canal, a small radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and a thin wire in its fur. The first mission of a cat spy was to eavesdrop on two men in a park near the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The cat was released nearby, but was almost immediately hit by a taxi. However, Robert Wallace, a former director of the CIA's Office of Technical Service, disputed this version in 2013. He said the project was abandoned due to the difficulty in training the cat. This failure, accompanied by other failed tests, caused the project to get shut down in 1966.
Respect. I'm back in. I'm back in. Impossible to tame. Impossible to train. Cat said, I ain't no fed. Yeah.
7. USA's gay bomb. The idea of a gay bomb, a non-lethal chemical weapon designed to make enemy soldiers attracted to each other, was considered by the U.S. Air Force. This hypothetical weapon, mentioned in a 1994 Department of Defense document, aimed to disperse sexual pheromones among enemy forces to generate mutual attraction, leading to mass confusion and panic. Along with the gay bomb, other ideas were discussed, such as remotely engineering body odors using compounds found in bad breath and excessive sweating, with the goal of making the enemy so smelly that they could be easily detected by their opponents. However, there is no evidence that these weapons were used or that it's possible to create such a thing. If you want to discuss this video or suggest an idea for the next one, join my Discord, link in the description.